Hello, insatiable listeners. Season 6 is now complete. We are on a break in between seasons. I'll return on Wednesday, February 13th with a new theme and a big surprise. I can't wait to share it with you. I am so bad at surprises. So let's just say that if you love the type of conversations we have here, rabbit holes and experimenting, you're going to love it. In the meantime, enjoy these podcast interviews I've done recently. They are quite a range of topics, but hey, you know that's how we roll here. And there will be a few classic episodes leading up to season 7 that will help you get the most out of the season and a clue about the theme. Also, if you enjoy the show or have benefited from it, I'd so appreciate a review. You guys totally rallied this summer to get us to over 100. We're currently at 105, and I would love for us to get to 150 by spring. It really helps the show as it makes it easier for others to find it. And I'd like to read 2 recent reviews. This one from Insatiable Listener, and her review, or his, was more smash the patriarchy than light and love. If you want trite, simplistic solutions to health and wellness, this is not the podcast for you. You won't find bad diets or tidy Instagrammable quotes, but that's why it's amazing. Allie has a gift for interviewing that brings out her subject's authentic wisdom. It's perfect if you're curious about how to be healthier in all senses of the word, appreciate the nuance and complexity of our unique bodies, or if you just want to hear smart people talking to each other about how to navigate and destroy cultural systems and reassess our collective values. Thank you so much for that 5-star review, Insatiable Listener. Love that you're into reassessing our collective values. And another one that I'll share from Design Lover 757997. Nuanced, Smart, and Sassy Too is the title of her 5-star review. She says, I'm exhausted of the constant unhealthy messages that barrage us everywhere from Instagram feeds. Seriously, those people with the super round butts, they don't tell you it's implants. To our diet culture in general. Insatiable is my personal weapon of resistance against those messages. It's balanced, intelligent, and Allie, the host of the podcast, brings in some of the most interesting people I've heard in podcast interviews. Look, if you want to break free from rigid rules but still live a healthy and balanced life, Insatiable can help you carve out your own path. No rules, no dogma, just thoughtful new ways of seeing and being in the world. Thank you so much, Design Lover 757997. And I'll be reading some more in some upcoming episodes. If you have time or, again, have benefited from the podcast, here's how you can leave a review. You launch Apple's podcast app. You tap the search tab, and you enter the name of the podcast you want to rate or review, in this case, Insatiable. Tap the blue search key at the bottom right. Tap the album art for the podcast. Tap the reviews tab, and then tap write a review at the bottom. And if you don't have time for that, if you could just rate it, how many stars you would rate it. That is also super helpful as well. And thank you for being a listener. Having stimulating conversations is what I most treasure in my life. And I get to have them here. And then with you on Instagram, where I connect with so many of you through your emails and also with our guests. It's a joy I cherish deeply. Look forward to seeing you back here in a couple of weeks for new episodes on Wednesday, February 13th. And in the meantime, enjoy these recent interviews and classic episodes.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Naked Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Sage Hobbs, author and creator of Naked Communication, and I'm so psyched you're here. This show is all about taking charge of your life in new and inspired ways to create a life you deeply love. It's about being more you in all areas of your life, more courageous, more free, more alive, more naked. I'll be sharing stories and advice from amazing people around the world who are up to incredible things on how they are successfully breaking free from fear and old patterns in order to create incredible relationships and impactful lives so that you can do the same. This is the place to be inspired to live a courageous and naked life. Let's do this. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Naked Conversations. I'm your host, Sage Hobbs, and I'm so honored that you're here as always. I have a really great guest today who I'm excited to introduce you to. This is episode 36. So if you want to check out the show notes and any of the resources that are mentioned today, you can do that over on the website at sagebhobbs.com/episode 36. While you're there, check it out and listen to other episodes that might be interesting to you. You can see more about my book and what people are saying about it, Naked Communication. You can get access to the free resource guide over there, which I talk about in episode, I believe it's 33. It's kind of my digital home, though I have to be honest, I much prefer the real world to the interwebs and having this conversation with you in your earbuds or your car or wherever you're listening. So episode 36 over at sagebhobbs.com, and you can check out the resources, how to work together, my book, etc. over there. So today's guest is Ali Shapiro. And wow, this is one of the deepest episodes that I've done. Every episode has been such a delight and everyone has so much wisdom to offer, but Ali goes really deep on some intense topics that I've been exploring more myself lately. And it was really just an honor to have this kind of honest and raw conversation with someone who's very bright, very passionate, and very knowledgeable about the work she's doing in the world and her own self-discovery. So Ali Shapiro is the founder of Truce with Food. She's also the host of a top-ranked podcast called Insatiable and a holistic nutritionist, integrated health coach, and a rebel with a serious cause. And when you listen to the show, you'll really get a sense of what I mean by that. She's a disruptor. We talk about, in the first 5 minutes, I literally think we get into patriarchy, white supremacy, privilege, our healthcare system, capitalism. We go for it really quickly. We have some similarities that were interesting to touch upon as well, including our journeys with cancer. So Ali has so much to say on a host of topics, all really couched within our health and wellness, our relationship to food, our diet culture, body positivity, all of these things that are both academic and practical in the way that she discusses them. She created her Truth with Food method while in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania. That's another thing we have in common alma mater, where she earned her master's in organizational dynamics, which is kind of like getting an MBA in the change process. And she drew from her decade and more of working with real life clients and her own personal healing journey from having cancer as a teenager to really manifest this work in the world around truce with food. So like I said, we get into a lot of things about speaking truth to power, the nesting dolls of capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, the inequitable systems and structures of our battles with food, emotional eating, public health injustice, so much more. So I'm really excited for you to learn from Ali. It really could have been a couple of episodes, so maybe we'll have her back on. And with that, let's do it. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Naked Conversations. I have Ali Shapiro here with us today. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Sage and listeners.
I'm really excited to introduce you to Ali and to her work. We've been chatting already quite a bit before I turned on the mic. So we already got
We almost solved world peace
we already got our connective juices going. I know, right?
like under 20 minutes.
Under 20 minutes across the country. One of my favorite things about podcasting is like the instant community that you can create just by, having people on your show, being on their show. There's just this amazing network that gets formed. So I'm really happy to have you here.
Yeah. Because we all want more naked conversations, don't we? But we don't get that on social media and stuff.
Totally.
Yes.
Totally.
Feels so good to connect.
That's me. I'm like imagining myself like out there, like with a big flag that's something about being naked and all of the misinterpretation of what that means. But what it's really about. When I chose that brand, actually, I was like, I know that they're probably going to invite some salacious, something here, but it's really peeling back the layers.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what the word searches are of people who find your website, right?
Oh, totally. What are they really trying to find? Right, exactly. So I'm really excited to dive in with you and just to have it be like it always is. My intention is for it to be very real, very open, for women to have a place where they can truly listen to other women who are up to big, amazing things in the world and see themselves in their stories, see the opportunity for them to be more real, peel back the layers, show up more authentically, more nakedly. And I can already tell by our conversation thus far that this will not be hard for us to do, Ali. I begin every podcast with the same question because I think it really gets at the heart of what it takes to live a naked life and to live a powerful life as an emerging female leader, if you will. So here it is. Ready?
Yeah.
What does courage mean to you?
Yeah. So full disclosure, I obviously listened to your podcast, so I knew I was going to be asked this question.
You'd be amazed how many people are still surprised by it. I love that though. You did your research.
I did. And I think the phase of my life that I am in is courage means speaking truth to power right now. That to me, I have my own podcast, and it's no secret that the 2016 election really rocked my world. And it's part of the things I really love about you, Sage, is you talking about your privilege and examining it. And it's something from a racial standpoint I've been doing since 2016. I grew up with city school teachers as parents who were pretty progressive. And, I thought I was somewhat educated, and then going through cancer at 13, and then really starting to dive into why I always joke I'm ahead of my time. I was getting cancer before everybody was back in the 90s.
Oh, that's such dark humor.
I know. Well, I always say dark humor is a side effect of chemotherapy, right?
Oh my gosh, totally. Yes.
In my early 20s, as my health started to deteriorate from the chemotherapy and other things, I started to research more, and it really sent me down this rabbit hole of the medical industrial complex. We were speaking before the show, it's easy to say big pharma and all that stuff, and big food and big agriculture, and, big pharma saved my life.
Right. Mine too. Mm-hmm.
And it's also a matrix. And so I really felt as I started to really tell people, hey, you can get rid of your depression if you change your eating. And, sometimes you have to emotionally blow up your life too, which I had to do to get rid of my own depression. But walking that nuanced line, and of course it doesn't, everyone is very different. I'm not saying that's a blanket solution, but my point in all this is I learned to really speak truth to power in the medical system and what's really happening on a certain level in my little neck of the woods, right, of what I work on with people. And at the time when I started my health and wellness company 12 years ago, this was radical information. I was going to corporations and telling them how nutrition mattered. Fast forward 12 years, a lot has changed. And so I thought that I was really, yes, thank goodness. Although then now it's become kind of this moral issue when people aren't looking at the systems and structures, right, of why people are in poor health. And after the election, I just saw another huge blind spot that I had in terms of race and in terms of how it's part of the nesting dolls of, if you look at conventional health and beauty standards, and I mean who gets access to care, who gets prescribed stuff, who doesn't. You have capitalism inside of the first one. Then you have white supremacy inside that. And then you have patriarchy inside of that. And this is why women are dismissed when they come into the medical system. This is why we've had Black people being experimented on and not getting enough pain medication, and, or people of color in general. And this is why our medical system is based on capitalism, not health anymore. That's a long answer.
Wow. Yeah. We got to unpack that quite a bit. Hold on. Because that's amazing.
Yeah. So I became an advocate for the Affordable Care Act. And I was really shocked about how the wellness community was kind of silent on that, at least in my world and people that I had been following. I've since reoriented who I follow and who I admire and who I'm looking at as leaders. But that was really shocking to me. I was like, look, I know the healthcare system has issues, right? Part of my business is to help disrupt it. And we have to be advocating for everyone to have care. It's been a really, dark night of the soul, or a lot of digging deep in terms of the past 18 months, looking at another layer of how we have to really lead moving forward so we can really change things and not put lipstick on the patriarchy.
So you went deep so fast and I loved it. Right away. You just threw out capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy in terms of nesting dolls in the first 5 minutes. So this is going to be juicy, people. If you're listening, we're going into it. So, and this is the year, 2018 was the year that I sort of had this awakening of reconnecting with my inner activist. So I love that, of course, here you are, as a person who's on the show. But I want to rewind just a little bit because I feel like that term speaking truth to power is something that I've been reading and seeing in places. I believe I was reading it recently in Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness. I've seen it around other places. It might have been Glennon Doyle. I can't remember Glennon Doyle, Melton. But I want to unpack that just a little bit because I'm not sure everybody understands what that means. When you say speaking truth to power, what does that really mean to you?
I love that you asked that because I think we typically think of power as a patriarchal power, right? Dominant over the other person. And to me, power is about choices. It's about knowing what choices we have and having choices in general. And so the example of, I'll take an example in my industry. There's a lot of fat shaming, right? And telling people that, oh, hey, if you're fat, it's because you don't have discipline and willpower, right? That's kind of the model, right? Or at least that's what people think of themselves. let's look at the choices. We actually know that part of being healthy anymore is having the financial capacity to have access to healthy food, to have the time to cook healthy food, right? This debate right now about poor people, and I even hate to say poor, but low income people, what they buy their food stamps with. That's implying that like they're not disciplined, when really often they're working 3 jobs and they have to pick convenience food because, first of all, there's no healthy food. They're in a food desert. And second of all, they don't have the choice to cook because they don't have the time. So for me, speaking truth to power is let's really unpack the choices people have. Let's really look at what's available in terms of, in my case, of health. And then we can really have a more honest discussion.
Got it. So really looking at what the power systems are, what the structures are at play here, and then coming into it with an honest and open dialogue around what's really going on.
You said your inner activist is reconnect. I would have never considered myself an activist before the election. I mean, I've always voted. I've been interested in politics, aware of that, and felt like my activism was my business in a way, but maybe not so much in a public health kind of way. So I just want to, preference this with like, I'm kind of new to the party, or late to the party and new to the party.
Yeah.
So I include myself in this, like, okay, this is why this matters to me right now, because I was angry at myself for a while. So it's not to come in here and be like, you're not talking about this or whatever, but it's like, can you hear the voices of people who are struggling and marginalized? A lot of my clients, they may have racial and economic privilege, but they've been dismissed in the medical system, right? Their doctor, when they're gaining weight or they're depressed, it's like, oh, it's all in your head, or it's a willpower issue. Go on Jenny Craig. And it's like, wait a second, there's some real physiological imbalances and a lot of emotional work that they need care for. And often are the canaries in the coal mine of what's happening environmentally and whatnot. So yeah, it's coming in with more of an open mind that, hey, maybe we don't really know what's working, and maybe we should question the models that are in place, because look, we spend a ton of money in America on healthcare, and we are one of the sickest countries. Like, something isn't working.
Right. Yes. A broken healthcare system. It's something's going on. And with well-intentioned, I want to also preface this to people who are listening. It's not to say that there aren't incredibly good people out there in the healthcare system who are doing the work and having conversations and trying to all the models and systems and tools they have to help people and heal people and talk about wellness. They're, of course, good people. To me, this isn't a conversation that's coming from us versus them, right versus wrong, but it's about, can we look at what's broken and have a bigger conversation around the power structures and the shortcomings, basically.
Yeah. I'm so glad you clarified that, because, a lot of my clients are physicians, therapists, nurses, PTs in the traditional systems. And again, this is why I think power systems and structures are so important to talk about, because you have really amazing people trying to do miraculous things because the system is so broken, right? They're just as frustrated. And I also want to say, in defense of the medical care system that we have right now, it was never designed for the chronic illness and the chronic struggles that a lot of people are dealing with right now. It just wasn't designed like that to begin with. That's another point that I think is really important.
Okay, we can go back to that in a little bit here. But before we do anything else, I want people to know who you are and what you do, because we really kind of launched into what your background is. And while they will have heard a little bit in the introduction, I want to know, your work is about this truth with food method and this idea of, I love this idea of radical truth for every body, but I want you to tell people about it. What is this all about and how did you come to do it? We jumped ahead of ourselves. We're such overachievers.
Hi, I'm Allie. I want to burn the patriarchy down. What do you do?
We got naked real quick.
I know. This is a little sidebar. I was talking to my sister about how you do social media, because she has a tech startup and she's had some consulting, and she's like, Allie, think of social media as like a cocktail party and like a light conversation that you'd have. And I'm like, well, what I'm sharing is what I talk about at cocktail parties. She's like, okay, that's what we need to talk about.
Maybe that's why I'm struggling so much to ever enjoy social media, because I've never been that kind of cocktail party gal.
Right. Me either.
You and I should have our own cocktail party, because we would really have fun talking about the real shit.
Exactly. And I find with my clients, a lot of them, that's what they want to talk about. I feel like everybody does.
Me too.
But everyone's going to look like that person that's like, whoa, too fast,
too fast, too intense, too much. Right. Totally. Yeah. Totally.
So radical truth, I'll start with that. Radical truth for everybody is, and body is political body. It's the environmental body, our earth body, and it's our physical bodies. I had cancer as a teenager. And before that, I had gone to Weight Watchers for the first time at 11 years old. And I had gained weight as a child, and I never knew why. Now that I have the framework of functional medicine. I was exposed to pesticides. I was doing somersaults on a friend's yard whose lawn had been sprayed. My parents never got that done, but everyone in the suburbs did. I had a horrible rash for 2 weeks. The doctors didn't know what it was. And then a couple years later, I'm diagnosed with cancer. So there's other things.
Right. It's hard to know when you've done some sleuthing. There feels like there's some connection to you.
Yeah. A research paper, 2 years ago, 25 years after the fact, connected pesticide exposure to childhood cancer. So, we often know these things intuitively. And I think part of us losing our way with our intuition is like, oh, we have to wait for a study. It's like, okay, the earth is the system we depend on to live. If it's unhealthy, we're going to be unhealthy.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, I had really struggled with my weight. And then after going through chemo, I lost a ton of weight. And what I didn't know at the time was I was basically running from trauma, but I got really into exercise. So a lot of people who after cancer get into some sort of health modality and kind of become obsessed with it. And because I was the first generation of childhood cancer survivors, they were just really excited we were alive, as was I. Again, the system wasn't prepared for survivors. And so I basically got really into working out, got really skinny, and then went to college, struggled with emotional eating, was diagnosed with depression, was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. I had tried Accutane in college. My acne came back. I was having heartburn, all of this stuff. And I just kind of had this moment. I went to the doctor and I continued to gain weight. And of course it was because I was binging, but I was like, oh, maybe it's my thyroid. And basically the doctor was like, no, your thyroid's fine. And she gave me a recipe that included salmon and she told me to put Splenda on top of it. And I had known from my own research that artificial sweeteners were considered a carcinogen by independent research. I don't know why that tipped me off of all the information, but it sent me down a rabbit hole. So I basically started realizing I was gluten intolerant. My gut had been destroyed from chemo and all the steroids I had been on. Healed all of that. A lot of my issues went away. And then I had to basically blow up my life to get the remnants done. And I started testing this Whole Foods model at the time, which was 12 years ago. This, again, was very radical. Because the radical truth for me was I did not have all these diagnoses. These were symptoms. Yet I kept trying all Western medicine and it just wasn't working. I mean, frankly, that's why I turned to alternative stuff.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And so I realized oh my God, no one's in charge at the wheel and I can be my own healer. It doesn't mean I don't use other people or other modalities, but holy shit, I have to lead this. And that was a very dark night of the soul because, if you've gone through something like cancer, which, obviously you have a lot of faith in your doctors and they are like God in a way too. You have to trust in them.
That's what I was going to say. I remember very clearly, first of all, having it at 13. Wow. I was 23. I still felt like I was in this very seeking stage of life in terms of my identity and my next steps and all of that. But 13, you're really, really on the cusp of your own identity discovery. So I can't even imagine. And I remember people thinking I was so brave. I was handling it with so much poise and so much grace. And on reflection, I can see that I did. I had a really great attitude. I used my resources, but I kept saying what you're saying, which is I just did what I had to do. They're telling me this is the best possible way for me to live. I'm going to do that. You know what I mean? I was I'm going to do that. That's what needs doing in order to have the best possible outcome. So I hear what you're saying. There is an act of surrender that sort of inherently has to happen. It doesn't mean you have to put your blinders on or you can't ask questions or advocate, but once you choose a path, there is a way that you have this real trust in the people who are delivering your care. So it is radical to sort of push back. We don't have a system where that's typically done.
Not at all. Exactly. I mean, it's changing a lot. And after clients work with me, they tend to change their doctor to an integrative MD as a result, because they're like, oh my God, there's so many more choices. Again, I didn't know I had other choices, right? The power was in the medical system, not with me. And so I started, on the side after I had gone to the Institute for Integrative Nutrition and mentored in functional medicine for 4 years, basically seeing people on the side. And I'm like, maybe this is just me. Because again, this was 12 years ago. So I felt like this alien. I was like, guys, I felt like a hippie. And there's nothing wrong with the hippies, but I never considered myself a hippie, right? That identity was not for me. I was like, this is bizarre. And so I eventually left my corporate job. And after a year of really getting people healthy and them having their own results like this, I started to realize that we stopped talking about food at the fourth session. And they were making these lifestyle shifts and changes. And I simultaneously noticed that as I built my business, my own eating got better because I was still emotionally eating at night, I would say, right? Because I wasn't really doing emotional eating work at the time. I was like, I've come so far and yet I still have this emotional eating issue. But I found that the more resilient I became, food became a non-issue for me. And of course, this happened over a time period, but it made me go back to school, which is when I went back to Penn, your alma mater as well.
I know we have several overlapping parts of our lives. It's kind of wild.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I studied organizational dynamics in grad school, which is basically like an MBA in human behavior. And I really studied the change process. And you mentioned identity. And I realized that the key for people to have lasting health changes is they have to have an identity change, right? And unfortunately, the way that we traditionally focus on behavioral change is like, we just look at the habits, right? Just like we just look at the symptoms. We don't look at the mindset and the identity that's causing all of the habits. And even today, right? Like, in the health field and in the coaching field, positive psychology, motivational interviewing is really popular. And that stuff is great to get us started. But what's going to get us finished is when we look at the unconscious issues that are identities that are very protective in our life, like being a patient rather than an advocate, right? Mm-hmm. For a lot of my clients, it's, oh my God, I'm a leader and a hard worker, which is now why I have to throw my body under the bus, right? I don't have time to do it all. Mm-hmm. And so I really developed a truly integrated model that really helps people look at and by academia, we would say biopsychosocial. In magazines, we would say mind, body, spirit. Same thing, right? But really giving people agency back and giving them the self-trust that often our culture has robbed of us. Because I work with a lot of women, right? And the patriarchy assumes the default is women are inferior. And that is integrated, that DNA is integrated into all of our systems. So it's so hard to see. But really giving women saying, hey, listen, you don't have an inner food rebel, right? In the food issue realm, that's an inner protector that's keeping you safe and has gotten you a lot of things in life. And we can't try to eliminate that. We actually want to cultivate a relationship with that. So it's kind of like the big picture and then one concrete example of when you really take this feminist lens and you get to the truth of why we're battling food. It actually has some things to do with we don't know how to feed ourselves, which is also we don't know how to medicate ourselves, which is why we're all depressed and anxious. But there's also an emotional component to all of our diagnoses. And I also want to be clear with that. I am not one of these people who believe we attract our illnesses. Like, that's not, right. I believe that there can be patterns over time that maybe that's one factor, but that's not what I'm saying.
Right. And I appreciate you saying that because I think that that's where this starts to go for some people when they get into the sort of more woo space. That maybe that term isn't even the best one, but when we start looking at like that relationship to our thinking and our behaviors and our mindset and our identities, sometimes people go, well, is it my fault? Did I draw this into myself? And I really appreciate that you tease that out because I don't think that's what we're saying. I think we're looking at the larger systemic issues and how they impact who we are. So you said something about it, that there's something about how it keeps us safe. Can you tease that out a little bit for us more, that some of the ways that we relate to food have kept us safe?
Yes. So a perfect example of this on the surface. And again, if we bring this identity and mindset to food, we're bringing it elsewhere in our lives. So a classic example is women comparing themselves to other women's bodies, right? Mm-hmm. And on the surface, it's like, oh my God, like people don't like admitting that they do that, or they compare themselves to their old bodies, right? I mean, either old bodies or other women's bodies. But that is a result of living in a patriarchal society that up until 100 years ago, women didn't have access to their own resources, right? Mm-hmm. It was about your look, or it was about your family lineage, right? Your resource.
Yeah, what made you marriable so that you could survive? Somebody would take care of you. Yeah. And so you could be fed.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like, we've evolved. And like if we had web feet, this is like the web feet that we haven't shrugged off evolutionarily, yet. Like it's still a vestige from these times where there was a purpose for that. And so we have this protective side of ourselves. First it does, mental, then we're like, and I call it mental food gymnastics, but it could be mental gymnastics around life. And a lot of times people are like, we need to reframe those. We can't listen to those. And that's true. But more deeply, it's because we're feeling at risk in some way. And we're comparing ourselves because we feel behind or we feel not far enough along, right? And that's still based on that comparison mental model of really being in competition with each other. So that's an example of how it has kept us safe. It's not necessarily keeping us safe anymore, but it has for the past 5,000 years, right?
Right. Well, this is interesting because I feel like oftentimes when people start talking about the patriarchy in terms of women and their body and body image, and we start talking about it in terms of the media and all the messaging, which is all valid and has its place. But I actually don't know that I've heard it or discussed quite in this way, where it's like, well, beyond the media and how we've portrayed what women should look like and how we need to conform, there is a historic component to the fact that we were expected in the West. Let me be clear. This is in the West, because I'll share why I'm saying that in a second. We were expected to be svelte and beautiful and, have a certain kind of body that was marryable. It's just, I hadn't really thought of that historical perspective quite that way. That therefore our relationship to what our bodies looked like impacted how we needed to survive. And the reason I tease out the West is because I had the opportunity to live in Kenya after college before I got cancer in between in that window there. And my beautiful Kenyan host mother just wanted to fatten me up so badly. She could not help herself. She just kept trying. She's like, "You're too skinny. You'll never get a good husband." I'm a small woman, but I'm pretty average size, 5'3" or something, in the weight charts or whatever it is. I don't know what average is really, but I'm not emaciated, but it was a very interesting experience for me to have my perception of beauty be flipped so differently in a different cultural environment, where she was going no, this is not good. You are too small. You are not strong enough to bear children here. And not that she thought I was going to stay. She knew where I was from. She knew, but she was desperate to make me fit into her model. And interestingly, that was survival too.
Yeah. And I would say it's not even about being thin, right? Because women's bodies, what they look like and what's been attractive has changed. Right now, just in this current historic moment, it is about being thin. But this is also part of the problem with the new body positivity movement and Fitspo, right? It's or strong is the new sexy. We're still setting up a comparison, right?
And something to attain. Yeah.
Yeah. And people are right that it's about the media, but that's the capitalistic nesting doll. No one is safe in a capitalistic society, because if you feel safe, you're not going to buy shit, right? I joke they can't make women feel any more worse about themselves. So they've moved to men, right? And you look at men and
oh gosh,
they're being made to feel inferior now, right? And oh my God, you have to look young enough, keep your job. I mean, men's beauty products are selling like hotcakes right now.
Interesting.
So that's why I say it's part of that nesting doll, but it's still the comparison of who gets resources and who doesn't, right? Because in patriarchy, men have the resources, and then you throw on white supremacy. As much as it's about race, it's about power structures as well, right? It's about what level are you on the ring? And then you throw capitalism in there, and then it's okay, it's all about who has money and wealth. That's then how we determine who's in the hierarchy and gets resources. That comparison thing and safety is really big. And what's really interesting that I've learned in the past year and a half is these conflicts that we feel when we feel unsafe come back to conflict models. And in a white supremacy culture, conflict is viewed as very bad, very negative, very unsafe. I'm sure with your clients, I mean, it's oh, I don't want to cause a stir. I don't want to be high maintenance, or I feel like I'm being difficult. It's this internal conflict we feel, and we don't feel like that's a safe place. I mean, look at our political environment. We can't even have disagreements right now, right?
Right.
But so we never learn to handle conflict constructively. I mean, internal conflicts as well.
Right, exactly. So conflict is, women in particular, I believe, are trained more to be conflict avoidant. And then when we do that, there's a way in which we sort of silence part of ourselves from really being self-expressed. And that's part of the work that I do, is really about unlocking that again, or for the first time, perhaps, depending on how early and deep those messages were about going along, conforming, not rocking the boat, not making waves, not causing trouble, pleasing people, looking a certain way, do-gooderness. And I was a girl who wasn't particularly radical. I call myself a rule following rebel. I don't really like to get in trouble, but I like to push the boundaries, I think those messages are really, really strong still around how we present ourselves as women. And it really gets us tangled up in terms of our relationship to everything. And food is just one of the many things.
Exactly. And what's interesting that I found in my work, and I have on my website, people can take what's your comfort eating style quiz. And there's 3 different styles, and they're modeled off of the Thomas Kilmann conflict model. And I've actually found in my work that a lot of women are competitors. Now, granted, I work with really high achieving professional go-getting women, right? I see the avoiding piece in there a little bit, but there's also heavily competition, and there's also heavily accommodating as well, I've seen in my work. And that sets up a certain mental frame, right? If you're competing, it's winning or losing. If you're avoiding, it's all or nothing, which is why a lot of people eat on the all or nothing. They're all on a diet or they're not on a diet, right?
Right. The extremes.
Yeah. Yeah. Or with the accommodating, it's either or. Well, I don't have time to prioritize my health because my job needs me, my kids need me, all this stuff. And it sets up specific mental models that really block us until we can see them. And then we get more comfortable with conflict and we can, coming back to speaking truth to power, we feel more comfortable challenging power structures, even though, and then I will say a lot of them are perceived power structures as well, right? Like none of us are really in competition anymore for like to get married, right? We can all, well, not all of us, but many of us are making our own financial money in the world, for example, like that.
The options have expanded for sure.
Yeah.
The options have expanded, but the competition still feels real. I'm going to say that even from the women I work with and even within myself, I was laughing before we got on the phone. I was laughing to myself because I was hungry and I was really quickly like stuffing this delicious fig goat cheese into my mouth on crackers. Like, and I was like, gosh, you're not even like giving yourself a chance to enjoy this really like decadent snack that you happen to have on hand. You're just like fueling yourself and you're about to go talk about the relationship we have to food. I was like, isn't that timely? And we're taking a big trip this summer as a family. We're going to Europe. We're going to live in Spain and visit old friends, college roommates of mine and friends from France that I studied with 20 years ago. And we're taking our kids. And I can feel this desire to have my body look a certain way for this trip for whatever reason. Right. And I'm going to get naked here, y'all. Like it's been messing with my head. So I've started running and I'm not a runner. I actually played lots of sports in childhood and into college, but running has never really been my favorite. And I took it on as a way to like do this psychological challenge. Like how can I push myself through an edge for myself? Because for some reason I have like a block around that degree of that way of really getting myself to feel strong. And it excited me. So I took it on out of excitement and a new challenge. And all of a sudden I realized a few weeks in that I was like, oh, my body hasn't really changed. Thought something would shift here. And immediately I took the joy out of the experience of the strength and the running and the moving. You know what I mean? Because I attached it to this body-centric outcome.
Yeah.
But I noticed it, right? I'm a coach. I'm a coach. I have to coach myself. And I'm somebody who typically has felt pretty comfortable in my body and in my skin. And I have felt that way more so since I had cancer, where I got connected to the possibility of losing my body, of dying. And ever since then, it really made me love my body in a whole nother way. Like instead of seeing my body as having failed me, I saw it as having fought for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's resilient.
Totally. It's resilient. It was like, yeah, we're not giving up on you. Like you got work to do. Right. So I say that all because getting on this call with you, I was like, wow, food is primal. Like our relationship to food is pretty freaking primal at the most basic of levels. And it's complicated. So like, how do you help women really strip that down?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love what you just said because when I was emotionally eating and binging on sugar, I was like, I know sugar causes cancer. Why am I doing this? Right? Like I was like, this was in my early 20s. It's like the logic piece of this was like, I shouldn't be doing this. I don't want to be doing this. And that's kind of how I learned to strip it down for other people. I always like to go big picture and then get practical. But if we look on a metaphorical level, like hunger and food is so vulnerable, right? It forces us to open up to the outside world, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about being this like good girl who rebels. I joke that food and body is kind of like the good girl addiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now it's socially acceptable to pig out. It's socially acceptable to drink wine with the other moms, right? And you don't want to be the high maintenance one who has their special diet, or you want to be able to eat whatever you want. And there's so much to food that it's not about the food, right? It's about connecting, bonding. Freedom. Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
So food is this vulnerable thing. We have to eat. We have to be in contact with the outside world, in relationship with the outside world. And for women, again, historically, it's often meant being at risk when you open yourself up, whether it's using your voice, whether it's offering your food preferences, whether it's wanting to do something that's off the beaten path, like not have kids, like you're a lesbian, right? Like any way that you're different, right, is like extra vulnerable because of belonging. And at the core, that food issues come down to is about belonging, because we need belonging. That is not a health metric you're ever going to have your doctor ask you yet, maybe in a couple years.
Give you a little more time. You seem like you're on a good mission here.
Yeah. Well, no, I just think life is changing at like rapid speed. Someone might already be talking about this and I don't know. If you think about, again, primally, we survived being in tribes. And that's just how it was. Like if you watch the Nature Channel, the animal that strays from the pack, it's like gets pounced, right?
Yes, we do watch that at our house. I have seen that more than once.
Right? And so we need each other. We need to be connected. Food is also very intimate. It's the most intimate relationship we'll ever have. What we eat literally becomes our hair, our bones, our body, right? There's nothing more intimate than food. There's nothing more intimate or vulnerable. And so food issues at their deepest core are about being exactly who we are, not just the positive stuff, but the messy stuff and finding belonging and connection there. That's the big picture of what it's about. And I think my clients, who tend to be people who are outsiders, who were outcasted in some way, right? I was bullied. I had cancer as a teenager. I always felt different in some sort of way. This is shocking to them, right? They tend to not like groups. They tend to be suspect of groups of women in general, but that's part of the wound. It's part of the trauma, or they don't trust their body. What we really get to is the most obvious way that they don't trust themselves and feel at risk is they don't even know how to feed themselves. They don't even know what foods work for them, right? At this vulnerable level. So we experiment. I don't believe there's one diet that's best for everyone. And I believe that their bodies are not broken, are not inferior. They're actually quite wise and intuitive. And with the right experiments and the right guidance, your body will tell you and you can figure it out. So that's one component.
Wait, time out for a second. Because you say so much that I think is so second nature to you, but there's like so many pieces in there. I mean, you literally just said that our most intimate relationship that we have is with food, and that some of these women really feel like push back against the idea that we need community to survive and connect. So when you're asking them to look at that, that's feeling like cognitive dissonance for them or threatening in some way.
Well, what I do is, whether I'm working with someone individually in my truth serum session or in Truth with Food, is we diagnose the story. That when that story flares up is what makes them, what I call it, out of alignment. Because I'm not for anyone being like all or nothing, right? Like then we're just recreating this perfectionist like idea of false safety. So it's really about being able to eat what you want when you want, and realizing that if you do that 80 to 90% of the time, that's the maximum value you're going to get from nutrition, right? Like food can't save us from everything, right?
Right. No, that's good. No, but I like that you said that too. Earlier you said, sugar causes cancer. Like none of this is as simple as that, obviously.
Oh, well, and everything's multifactorial. We love silver bullet, right? Oh, it's so simple. No, everything's complex. It's going to take you longer than you think, and it's going to be more complicated, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's really emotional connection.
Yeah. What we do when we diagnose their story is there's an emotional trigger, right? Like, and if we take your example for going to Spain, and I don't know you well enough to I'm not trying to diagnose you or anything.
Go for it. Let's see. What do you come up with for me? Yeah.
But I would say, and again, I would take you through an entire hour process to do this, but I would say that part of why you want to look so great is that you're going to be in an uncertain and new environment, right? And so there's the chance of being misunderstood. There's so much of a learning curve. And yet we project all of this uncertainty, tends to be a big trigger for people, onto our bodies. Like, oh my God, I'll feel safer, which is really I'll feel more confident. I'll feel more relaxed. I'll feel easier to be the real me if I'm presenting to the world what I want them to see, right? It's kind of like a safety shield. And so we have a trigger like uncertainty or inadequacy or loneliness. And it's not the trigger itself, it's the story. It's the story of what it means. So for me, what I realized is why I was eating sugar and binging when I knew nutrition was really important a tool, not the tool. I realized that uncertainty sends me in a tailspin, because the one time that I was really uncertain, I was diagnosed with cancer, right? So that was a traumatic story for me. It wasn't a story that I was making up. I lived that. That is living in my body to this day. It's living a lot better with more space, but we have this trigger, and then we have a stress response based on that trigger, right? We have a physiological, you can do fight, flight, or freeze, but we have an emotional one, which is the comfort eating styles, which is, oh my God, there's an emotional conflict here. It's, do I have to compete here? Do I have to avoid? Do I have to accommodate? And then we have behaviors that come from that. And all of that then leads to the out of eating alignment. When I was talking about habit change, we got to get to the root. This is what's happening unconsciously, and it happens within seconds. And because these patterns have usually happened for so long, we think of them as who we are, not behaviors that we're doing.
Right, exactly. They're collapsed. I talk about this all the time, not at all related to our body and food, but so it's really cool to hear it related in this way, because it's so much about they see it as the way it is versus choices, perspectives, stories, that there's a possible other interpretation can be so mind-blowing, and it can shift everything.
Yes.
But I never think about this in terms of food, because like I said, this hasn't been my issue. For whatever reason, I have probably as weird of a relationship with food as many women do, but it's never been something that's caused me a lot of struggle or strain. There's other things that have. You know what I mean? So I love looking at it through this lens that you're sharing with me, because it's sort of fresh for me. Right. Of course our stories shape relationship to our body and food.
Yeah. And I would say because you're smaller and you're attractive and you're white, it's
been easier for me.
Yeah. And look, I'm white and I'm a normal sized body, but I was 30 pounds heavier for a while, But that's often, and a lot of my clients are actually, I wouldn't say a lot of them, but half of them actually are normal weight, right? But then their body starts changing, right? And that feels just as scary. Not because they are like, oh, I've had privilege, but they're like, oh my God, like this isn't the me that I know. And this is a big part of my identity.
Yes. And you're right that part does really land for me, how much is a part of my identity. If all of a sudden I had some type of condition and I put on 30 pounds, I would really struggle to feel fully like myself. And that's an interesting thing to consider.
Yeah. And then if we extrapolate like that, what is the self, right? And it's like,
right. I know. Exactly. Yep.
And so to kind of go back to the Spain issue, right? And I would say because you don't have a long history of worrying about it, there's not going to be so much tension there as there would be for someone else who they really don't feel like they can show up as the real them. And then all the uncertainty around food, right? On the surface, it's about the uncertainty around food and what will people think of me? And I don't like walking. I feel like my thighs are rubbing or whatever. And that stuff is true. But more deeply, we feel vulnerable and at risk because of our story. That in the past wasn't a story in terms of we were making this up and it's just our perception. Like, no, there's a somatic trigger that happens. And this is why with the work I do with clients, it's like, progress is seeing the story as it's happening and catching it even after the fact, because we're rewiring nervous systems here. This is not a logical issue. I wasn't binging on sugar because I didn't know sugar was bad for me. No shit, right? It's like my nervous system, though, there was other uncertainty in my life. For a while, it was around dating. And then, I met my husband and I was like, oh, maybe now I'll feel good in my body. It was like, oh, a little bit better. And I was 30 pounds heavier when I met him. But then it was like, oh, my career. But it was every area where I just was feeling vulnerable and unaligned in my life. And it took me a long time to realize weight loss really wasn't going to solve that. Like it was a really shiny object that, again, media and historically would make me truly be safe and like I can finally exhale. But ultimately, it is an inside job.
Ultimately, it's an inside job and it has so much more to do with safety than most people normally consider.
Yeah. I mean, I share this a lot, but the adverse childhood experiences score, which is basically what the standard for measuring trauma in children. And we know that people who have autoimmune issues like MS, lupus, they tend to have an ACE score higher than 2. But what's interesting is those ACE scores came out of an obesity clinic. They thought they were studying obesity. And as people started to lose weight, they started to feel seen. And that really scared them because when they had been seen before, they had been abused, they had been molested, they had been robbed. Like these are real issues. And when we're only looking at, this mechanical model of discipline or, why aren't you cooking and making it a moral judgment, we don't get to the root cause and we have very poor solutions. Hence the body image struggles, the weight struggles, the health struggles. They're all interrelated.
Yeah, I saw that often what you just mentioned in terms of the ACE score, which some people might not know what that is, but that's the adverse childhood experience score. And I believe that looks at, what you experience as a child and how it impacts certain factors in your adult life in terms of resiliency or not. Would that be an accurate way to sort of explain that?
Yeah, well, about how much trauma you've experienced.
But how they're connected, right? Like the trauma.
Oh, yes.
It's measuring the trauma and then what that looks like in adulthood, how that maybe has impacted.
Yes, totally. And I think it's really important for people to realize because when they hear trauma, my podcast episode is on this with Rebecca Bastian, who's an amazing therapist, is people think trauma is like refugees. That is definitely trauma or like surviving an earthquake or a fire. But it's all about the context of how resilient your system is to start, right? So if you're a sensitive person.
People have different thresholds, 100%. Yeah, they have different thresholds. I saw that as a counselor myself. I was 10 years in middle schools. And what would be so traumatizing for one child was so not for another based on their constitution, based on their past experiences. And now that I have 2 kids of my own, like really based on who they came into the world being. I really believe in the nature and nurture combo. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, right, I've got 2 kids. Their personalities are so different. Same parents, different output. They came in with different ways of being. So anyways, we all have different ways in which trauma can present itself.
Totally. Yeah.
And impact us. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I never go back and listen to my podcasts. I hardly ever go back and listen to my podcasts, right? Because I'm always on to the next one. And this one is so rich and so deep. I'm like, okay, we're like talking about the patriarchy and white supremacy and our trauma triggers related to our food. And I'm just like, whew, this was so good. And I know my listeners are going to love it. So thank you so much for sharing. I'll make sure also to put access to your work and your show in the show notes, of course.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I know it's a lot, right?
It's exciting because I feel hopeful. Also, like I feel hopeful, like that there's inside of these systems that are on their own somewhat scary when you think about a nesting doll, and if there are those who don't know what that is, I think they're Russian nesting dolls, typically the ones I've ever seen, right? It's like a little wooden figurine and there's another one inside, another one inside, another one inside.
I have a graphic that I can share within the show notes for people. So they see the one that I created for my website.
Oh, cool. Great. Yeah. When you say capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, it's like, whoa, right? It can feel like there's no way we can tackle all three of those freaking beasts.
And yeah. And I was going to say, and I don't know all the threads.
As you talk, I feel like there's hope.
Oh, that's why I'm so passionate about this. Because once you see it, to me, we need to redefine health as like vitality. And like, are we working to change this stuff, right? We can shape it. And the faster you see it, the more it totally reorients everything. I mean, you can even look at something simple like capitalism and its effect on our food system, right? It's like, oh my God, I should not be eating stuff as much as possible out of a package because what they're doing with chemicals and all this stuff. And it's because of capitalism. This is not food. Right. Like as soon as you can see these systems, you get more confident speaking up with your doctor. You get more confident being an advocate. You find the right practitioners. Everything changes once you can see this. It's super exciting. It's super freeing.
It's super freeing, but it could also be really overwhelming. So I want to really have people leave with something concrete that you advise they could do to get started, you know, because I mean, even when I hear you say that, my whole body goes, oh my gosh, I can't cook everything fresh.
Oh, I don't either.
And I think we eat pretty well, you know, like my husband has celiac disease. So we've had to like modify our diet, but I'm like, cheese is in a package. You know what I mean? Like pretzels that I serve in my children's lunch is in a package. Am I mindful of that? I am familiar with most of the ingredients. Yes. I live in, there's food deserts is a term that we may have thrown out in this show, and a really interesting concept about places where there are in lower income communities where they literally don't have access to the same degree of nutritional produce and such that we do. I live in a freaking cornucopia. Like within 2 miles of my house, I think I can walk to 3 grocery stores, 2 of which are like health food stores, right? And still, when I hear you speak to, okay, we shouldn't eat it from package, or we have to be really aware, like plugging into the system, then it opens our eyes. There's a little bit of fear that I get, and I know somebody listening has got to be with me on this, being naked again here. Like, oh, it's so much. It's so overwhelming of what I'll have to fix or change, or what if then I'm like freaked out that I can't eat anything. So how can you like leave us with a couple of things that we can do or try out to get us started?
I love that. And I'm glad you brought that up because I eat food out of a package. My husband goes to Costco, right? Like, I mean, this is not about, this is not, again, about perfection. Like the body is more resilient than we think. And you always have to split the difference, right? Like that's just the world we live in. So I would say I'm going to give people 3 things. 1, I always recommend people do a breakfast experiment to get started. So have like a vegetarian breakfast, like have quinoa or oatmeal with, you know, a couple walnuts and some cinnamon. Then try having the next day eggs with kale. And if you do green smoothies, throw in a green smoothie. And pay attention to which one makes you feel better. Your body will tell you immediately. You will know immediately. So do a breakfast experiment.
I love that you gave those 2 examples of the food because already I feel like you are not coming from a camp.
Oh, no.
And I really appreciate that because like I said, I'm so exposed to like plant-based diet, vegan or 100% paleo. And it's like, well, there's research behind both of them. You know, what do you do? So I love that you're asking us to experiment.
Oh, yeah. I joke that people who don't have religion find nutrition, right? We're all looking for some sense of order. And myself, when I finally stopped emotionally eating, I found myself overworking until I saw that pattern. So, you know, it's like we're all trying to unwind these extreme patterns within ourselves.
Right. Totally. Breakfast experiment. I derailed you from your 3 things. Breakfast experiment.
Yeah. But I just want to say that's part of why it's so extreme, right? Because you got to look at who's delivering the message. So try that breakfast experiment. Then the other thing I would leave people with, and start there because your body will tell you, look for your energy levels, look for cravings, and look for focus. That's a big thing. Those 3 things you can look for the next 2 to 4 hours, because how you eat at one meal will set you up for the next 2 to 4 hours. You know, so check that out. The second thing is next time you have body image issues or you're really feeling frustrated by your weight, rather than thinking like, how many calories do I have to count? Ask yourself, where do I feel at risk? And you may not get the answer right away. You might say, no, it's really about my weight or whatever. That's fine. Just sit with that and see what pops up. Where do you feel vulnerable? And that can be when you want to start to eat or when you start to feel bad about your body. So I would have people do those 2 things. And then I would really encourage them to take my quiz.
Yeah, totally.
at allyshapiro.com, because that, again, they can see what kind of comfort eating style they prefer. And there's some tools there to start to get out of those patterns.
Awesome. Those are super tangible.
Oh, good. Yeah. No, I'm very practical. I know we went very big picture here, but you need to give people practical tools. Otherwise, what are we doing here? Right.
Right. And it just gets, it's so important that we look at the systems that are in place that oppress and restrict. And at the same time, if we can't get in there and give us a starting point, my experience is that people get paralyzed. They can't act because they're like, whoa, this is so huge. I can't even get started. I kind of really enjoy that we looked at these big systemic concerns around privilege and capitalism and then broke it into, but where do I begin? Inside of the systems, inside of the constructs, where can I begin? And then we can peel back the layers from that starting place. It's awesome to marry the two. So thank you for doing that with me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked those tips, because my clients, they don't come in wanting to burn the patriarchy down, right? That's not what
That's not the first line on your website.
Yeah, I mean, it's there, but you have to come to it. Like, right, I've been thinking about this stuff for 12 years, and I just now have gotten into being able to see the bigger systems. I mean, I always saw it in healthcare and capitalism and patriarchy, but white supremacy is new for me, right? So I'm like a baby seal here. Like, I don't know all the ways it's happening. But it was piece by piece. And when my clients get done working with me, they're angry, right? Because they've been put on medicines that have actually hurt them often. They've been put on birth control for reasons that they didn't need to be on it, and it's numbed their emotions. And I always say anger, is often an unmet need. It's like, yes, then they're engaged in that way, but you have to get yourself well. When you're so tired or your moods are so all over the place, or you have heartburn, which again, that was the situation I was in. Like, you got to get yourself together first. And I think for women, again, prioritizing themselves is resistance, right? That's resistance. It's like, no, I matter. I'm not inferior. I can take up the time and space and resources in my life to get myself well. That is resistance.
Right. It's a resistance to the structure and the conditioning we've been given.
Yes.
Awesome.
Start there.
Start there. Thank you, Ally, so much. I'm really looking forward to getting to know you better, learning more about your work, seeing you out there as a new activist, because I do think this is a form of activism. I think the definition of activism can be broader. It doesn't always mean the rallies, although those are important too. But where are we willing to raise our hands and have the hard conversations and push back against systems that are oppressive, and are restrictive. And I so appreciate that you're in there with all the practical and all of the big picture, pushing this forward. And I really can't wait to see, how it continues to unfold for you. So thank you so much for being a part of the show.
Well, and thank you for creating the space that we can have these conversations, because I can't really always talk about this stuff.
Right.
So thank you, Sage.
You're so welcome. I did it for myself because I don't know how to not say what I'm thinking sometimes. My children will tell you. So I had to create a naked brand so that it was like, all right, let's model what we want, what is natural for us and what we really want others to be able to do more freely. So I really appreciate the courage and the forthrightness of what you brought to the table today. I can't wait to continue the conversation.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate you being in your natural state.
Thanks, Ally.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Naked Conversations. Yay! It really means the world to me every time you show up. And if you want to know more about how to work with me personally and my coaching, you can check that out over at sagebhobbs.com. You can also get some great free resources over there about how to make powerful requests and many blog posts full of resources for living a naked life, as well as grab a copy of my book, Naked Communication: Courageously Create the Relationships You Really Want. Thanks again. See you next time.